Hello and welcome to another episode of Intentionally Act Live. I'm your host, Enrico E. Manalo, and I am here today with Dr. Lily Ann B. Villaraza, who is a Philippine historian, Filipinx American Storyteller, and department chair of the only Philippine Studies department in the U.S., located within City College of San Francisco. Hey, Lily Ann, what exactly is language equity?
Oh, that's a big question. And before I answer, thank you so much, Enrico, for inviting me on the
Of
show.
course.
So when I think about language equity, a lot of it revolves around ensuring that resources and information, specifically related to things of public service, education, etc., are accessible in the languages that are predominantly spoken in a particular place. It's also ensuring that the translations of materials are culturally appropriate. So it's not just one to one.
Mm,
I threw it into Google Translate and we're good, because we'll get into that with Filipino. And then also recognizing the importance of multilingualism and
mm.
being multilingual, and encouraging in an honest way the learning of language. I really do think that that's something that needs to be cultivated more in the United States. So that's language equity.
Great. Yeah. So I hope it's clear from that description how this is connected to diversity, right? So when we're talking about diversity, we don't just mean skin color, we don't just
Mhm,
mean income, we don't just mean gender. We
mhm.
mean across all the many dimensions that exist for human beings, and that includes language, right?
Yes.
So if you've heard people kind of say, like, well, the title of the show is Speak American, or Speak English, right? What's behind that is
Mhm,
kind of assimilationist thinking, right?
mhm.
Or dominant thinking, if you wanna go there. So before we get too deep into that, quick question for you, Lillian, is what made you fall in love with what you do?
Ooh, oh my God. So lots of different things. And I've been blessed to have so many people kind of guide me, whether they know it or not, throughout my entire career. So I took Tagalog Filipino in middle school and high school in San Diego. I was part of one of the first language programs that were established in San Diego Unified.
Wow.
And then I went on and found my historian mentor at UC Irvine when I did my bachelor's, and he is a Philippine historian, and he's like, hey, you're gonna go get your PhD and you're gonna study Philippine theater. I'm like, okay, and that's actually what I ended up doing 10 years 10 years later. I'm like, I guess I'll do this now. And language has always been a part of that journey.
Yeah.
And it's been such a blessing and guide. And what drives me now is really supporting other folks find that love too. So that's always, it's always a thing.
Ah, well, that's so great to hear. And for people watching, they might not know this about the Philippines. It is the only Asian country that was colonized by Spain. And one of the colonial moves that the Spanish enacted was the erasure of Philippine history. So it was not called the Philippines before that. In
Mhm,
fact, it did not have a unified name because it's a collection of islands.
mhm,
And one of the tools that they used was to essentially kill or even burn, in some cases, the keepers of the cultural histories of the
mhm,
various peoples of the Philippines.
mhm,
And so our connection to history has been somewhat disrupted. So this is why it's actually incredibly important for people to study Philippine history, and Filipinos especially.
mhm,
And it's not having a complete sense of your history, if you could even have that. It's very hard to understand where you've come from, and therefore who you are and where you would like to go.
yeah,
And so this is not a problem that is unique to the Philippines, but I felt like
mhm,
it's worth highlighting for our viewers who may not be Filipinos
yeah,
themselves.
yeah, yeah. And to kind of build upon that, the United States, you know, colonizing the Philippines and it being the only colony of the true only true colony of the United States, because the
Mhm.
United States collected other territories and etc. Um, that was perpetuated, that continued, right? English becomes the language to unify the archipelago,
Right.
and is used through universal education, that was instituted by the United States. But it becomes that question of, well, that's good and all, but what sort of sensibility of the local cultures and languages were honored and respected in those processes? So yeah.
Yeah, and I think because we are talking about language, so we've been talking about how Spain colonized the Philippines, but it wasn't like everybody there learned how to speak Spanish.
Oh God,
So
no.
my grandfather learned how to speak Spanish because he went to university, and that was the
Mhm,
language of
mhm.
higher education. So
Right.
it is also, I don't know if it's unique with the within the Spanish colonial sphere,
Mhm, mhm,
but while there were some efforts to educate Filipinos in
mhm,
Spanish, like in church and things like that,
mhm,
if you look at the various Filipino languages, it's been adopted in different ways and to different
mhm,
degrees depending on the language.
mhm.
And you might
Yeah,
recognize some of it. So when
yeah.
people from the Philippines greet each other
Mhm,
from the large island of Luzon, they might
mhm,
typically say like "Kamusta ka na," which is like, "Como está," but
mhm.
with other words added on.
Right, right.
So yeah, when we're talking about that colonial history, it's a multi-layered
Oh
thing,
yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And
And
Spanish was utilized, excuse me, as a way to restrict access to power, right? So
mhm,
who spoke Spanish? It was the friars, and they were able to basically say, well, you don't have to learn Spanish. I will learn your local language. So they're controlling the interpretation of
mhm,
the Bible and other things that were coming down from the colonial government. And Spanish becomes this mode of power
mhm.
during the Spanish colonial period. For the United States, it's it's like, oh, we open it up to everybody. Everybody can speak English. It becomes that question of, well, how was that English utilized? And we can get into that in a bit, but
It's a big
it's
topic.
yeah, it's really interesting to me to think about how even today, when you talk to people who move through the Philippine education system, and English is the mode of education still in the
Yeah.
Philippines, there's still this apprehension once they migrate out, that, oh, my English isn't good enough.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, okay, yeah, we'll talk. Let's talk about that. So, so yeah.
Yeah. So, we've been talking about language and language equity, and I'd like to kind of pivot a little bit to language
Mhm,
access. So,
mhm,
what's the big deal with language access, and why are we choosing to focus on Filipinos to
mhm.
talk about this?
So, and I will talk specifically about the state of California because I live in California, and this is true for several other states in the nation. English is not the predominant language of the state any longer, right? 44% of the it's it just boggles my mind that folks are so multilingual that it can't be denied that there need to be services and in different languages that exist in our society. And I think for me it's recognizing that not everyone speaks or understands English at the same level, right?
Mm,
It's like somebody can be conversationally adept in English, but there are, when you're reading something, you know, and you're trying to comprehend, you know, deeper kind of meanings of things, that becomes so much easier in a primary language, right?
mhm,
Um, we understand that there are difficult concepts that can or should be articulated in someone's primary language so that um, it is understood. Like, I think about how registration goes in terms of college, the
yeah,
colleges, right? It's like, okay, how do you explain registration to someone who might not have had experience with that in an American context, right?
right.
Because registration for higher education looks very different in different countries, right? And so how do you make that more accessible? And I know that there's that thing of, well, I'll just repeat it. It's like, just because you repeat something or say it louder or say it fast slower doesn't mean that it's going to become understandable, right?
Right.
um and language access and equity really is one of the foundations to building a more equitable society, period. Right. And it because it builds this feeling of respect within a multilingual, multicultural, multi-ethnic society. It's like, okay, I see that, I hear that, and I don't feel demeaned when I
Mhm.
say something differently, or I speak another language, or I have a different accent. Accent's
Mm,
a whole nother like
yeah.
thing that we can go into with this too, you know?
Definitely.
Yeah.
To your point, one of the ways of othering people,
Hmm.
and this is, it doesn't matter what country this is, what situation, really, but when somebody is coded as a foreigner, right? And that can
Hmm.
be simply through hearing how they speak. There's
Hmm.
often the assumption that, oh, these people, maybe there's like an element of criminality there, or at the
Hmm.
very least, non-compliance. Oh, these people don't follow the rules. Well, it's really hard to follow the rules if nobody's clearly laying them out for you in a way that you
Yes.
can understand. And
Right.
certainly in the time of COVID, we can see how, like, not communicating clearly and at a
Hmm.
deep and appropriate level can
Right.
have real world consequences.
Yeah.
So we were just talking about how the Bay Area is one of the most highly vaccinated areas in the world. And, if you're riding around on BART, or you are, even entering any municipal buildings, anything like that, you can see that there are many languages, and it's really clear where material in other languages is available to people.
Mhm.
So I think that just speaks to the strength of the ideas that we're bringing forward here.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so Filipino is one of the official languages of the city and county of San Francisco. I think about the number of Filipinos who live in the state and in the region, and how that really informs the fact that there need to be materials in Filipino, right? And I want to make clear, I know, and there might be folks out there it's like, well, Filipino is or Tagalog isn't the only language spoken in the Philippines. Absolutely, absolutely, right. But when we talk about um, national languages, right? Filipino is recognized as the national language of the Philippines, and
Yep.
so in terms of it being, and again, socially and locally appropriate, right? It's like, okay, well, it makes sense if you have a majority of folks who at least have you know an understanding of Tagalog, and many people in the Philippines, they while the education system is in English, they take Filipino as a
Mhm.
language, although that has I'm not going to talk about Philippine education system, but Filipino was taught as a class, right? And
Mhm.
so it makes sense that if we can't have Cebuano, Ilonggo, all these different languages, here's a gateway, right?
Right.
Here we have Filipino, and if we look at Hawaii, right, the third most spoken language there is actually Ilocano, not Tagalog,
Right.
right? And so that's a whole other thing too.
So Ilocano being another language from the Philippines, of course. Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that in the Philippines as well, the dominance of the language, well, yeah, definitely it's not spoken on all the islands, all the regions, but people watch TV, they watch
Mhm.
movies, right? And this is
Yes.
the language
Yes.
of media.
Yes.
So when we are talking about access, we're often
Mhm.
talking about entry points, right?
Mhm.
And it's about giving people greater chances for
Mhm.
success. Obviously, it's unwieldy and unworkable to provide materials in every single language that exists on Earth. That's
Mhm.
simply not possible.
Right.
And for some of these languages, there are no written forms anyway, so it,
Mhm.
it
Mhm.
might not make sense in certain
Mhm.
places.
Mhm.
But the fact is, if we are allowing the languages of dominant cultures, cultures that have great economic power, great
Mhm.
social power to
Mhm.
dominate, then what we see is that languages can actually go extinct, and they do
Mhm.
all the time.
Yeah.
Now, that might not seem like a big deal because, oh, well, everybody would speak the same language. But one of the benefits of having other languages is that they provide different perspectives on the
Yeah.
world, right? So these
Mhm.
are groups of people that have developed doing things a certain way because of preference, because of context, because of the environment, what have you.
Mhm.
And when we lose that, it's hard for us
Mhm.
to really realize what's missing, never having known it. But when we are able to interact with other people who do view the world in these ways, that's where a lot of the enrichment that diversity has the potential to achieve really comes from.
Right. And if we think about, you know, immigration and, Filipinos have been coming to the United States since the early 20th century in larger numbers. And so you have people who always there's always a need for language access in that way. There's always a need for materials that are in Filipino, right? And what I'm finding more and more, right? And I'm second generation. I was born and raised here. We have third, fourth, fifth generation Filipino Americans who are, seeking classes and opportunities to learn Filipino because it's that thing that you can't quite put your finger on it, but it makes you feel like you're connected and more grounded to something that is important to you.
Hmm.
So it is, language is definitely a part of identity development, particularly for folks who are in the diaspora.
Yeah.
um, but more importantly, it's we have to recognize, because there is a continual immigration of Filipinos coming from the Philippines, you know we can't just say, oh, well, they speak English anyway, which I hear a lot, right? It's like, oh, they learn English in the Philippines. Oh, but
Not the same.
it's not the same, and there's a comfort in seeing your language written out and accessible in that way. So,
Yeah, so for people who have never gone abroad to live, right, maybe to visit, but to live, uh, a lot of people are aware of culture shock, right?
mhm,
But from my time living in Vietnam, I lived in Vietnam for almost 5 years.
mhm,
And one of the things that amazed me was I never stopped getting culture shock, right? There
mm,
were these, I thought I would have a handle on things, and then
mhm,
some regular thing of
mhm,
feature of Vietnamese culture would just jump out at me, and I would not be prepared to handle it, right?
mhm,
Now,
mhm,
the US is a far larger country than
mhm,
Vietnam is, and certainly
mhm,
larger than the Philippines.
mhm,
And it's easy for us to move, for those of us who were born here, to kind of move through the various regions of the US, and it's not
mhm,
quite as shocking. Like, we know that perhaps people talk a little bit differently in one
mhm,
area than another, or we might
mhm,
be aware broadly of some of the opinions and the folkways. But for somebody who's from outside of the I don't know what you want to call it, like the America sphere,
mhm,
and it seems like there are fewer and fewer people that are outside of it, but this is largely an illusion.
mhm,
There's a density of cultural stuff that can be
mhm.
impenetrable, right? Even
Oh
if
yeah,
you're somewhat familiar.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so being confronted with all of that all at once, it's highly stressful,
yeah,
and
yeah.
it's not just mentally stressful, that can
Mhm,
lead into physical symptoms and things like that.
mhm, mhm,
And so that's all to say that the easier that we can make it for people to kind of get on the same page as us, and to help them to comply and to help them to fully participate,
mhm,
the more willing and able they're going to be.
mhm. And I think what some folks would say, it's like, well, the Philippines was colonized for 50 years. Filipinos are very well versed in American culture. You know, TV shows and movies and all of these things, American TV shows, movies, and all these things are available. Why would there be such a culture shock? Because the cultural context is different.
Yeah.
And we don't think about the emotional, psychological, and social impact. And like you said, if you travel around, it is very different. It's and how do you kind of navigate that. And even talking about language, right? I remember when I was in graduate school, there are a number of Filipino international students who went to my institution, and their English was different.
Yeah.
You know, there were certain terminologies that they would utilize in English. And I'm just like, what is that? I don't know this.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, somebody plays not in graduate school, you know, just like I should know this, you know, but it's that thing of the type of English that is you know, taught in the Philippines does not, you know, ready you for the idioms and the slang and the everyday conversation necessarily here. And that is a culture shock.
Mhm.
And folks are just like, no, 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 we're good. We have access.
Right, yeah. Language doesn't stay still, which is one of the
Doesn't.
difficulties about it, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that speaks to the idea that we have to keep up to with the standards of whatever languages are like exist at the time.
Mhm.
So that's a moving target, and that's hard.
Yeah.
One of the other pieces that I wanted to talk about is
Mhm.
identity formation.
Mhm.
Right.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, in terms of identity formation, how does language equity, language access kind of impact that?
Mhm. Um, so I will say this. I know that it provides grounding. And this is both from personal experience and from just having conversations for the last 2 decades with folks as we fight for, you know, Philippine history courses, but more specifically language courses. You know, there's a grounding that you garner in taking these kinds of things, and you develop a stronger sense of self. I know that that was my experience. I would not be who I am if it weren't for my Filipino language classes.
Mm,
I would not be as curious as I am about the things that impact our community if it weren't for my Filipino language courses. And my Tagalog is not it's I like using the word buluktot because it sounds funny. I love that word. And it's, you know, it's, and to translate that, it's like, oh well, it's twisted, it's kind of mishmash sometimes, and I don't even know, like, to again to translate one to one. I'm like, oh, I
yeah.
can't. I have to explain what that is, and I think that the part of that idea of me feeling like my Tagalog is buluktot is also that, like, I don't know if I'm speaking this right, but I'm still gonna do it, you know, because anybody who's speaking a language, and I encounter this with a lot of students who take Filipino, they're afraid of speaking it aloud because they might get made fun of, and I always tell
Mm,
them, it's like, you know what, I know that's a hurdle, I know that's a barrier, but once you are able to kind of jump over that and just be like, I'm just gonna do this, that opens up your world, not just for language fluency and comprehension, but it also really generates a feeling of greater confidence of not just speaking, but of where you're coming from. And for Filipinos, I think that's really important, you know, there, and where that kind of goes, and maybe again, I'm just speaking for myself, but you realize that there's a responsibility to become an advocate for this type of work and these types of learning possibilities, because you see how important it was for you, and you want other people to have those experiences and have access to it, right?
yeah.
You know, and I think that for folks who are looking for a deeper connection to ethnic identity and culture and community, you know, there are things that you cannot translate.
It's true.
You know, and so you're like, I like using the word guan, yung guan, yung ano, and people's like, what do you mean guan? And, that thing, that that thing, and guan is not thing. It does, again, does not translate one to one, but when you could, your mom could be like, oh, get that guan for me, and
Yeah.
you'll actually know what it is.
I've
just
noticed that that's a very
because
Filipino thing, right? So, yeah, my mom will definitely say, "Anak, pass me the," and be very vague
no,
about it, or even just point with the lip a little bit, and it's like, somehow I have an idea what she's asking for.
right, right, and it's not telepathy, folks.
Right.
It's that unconscious understanding that comes with language development and and nuance, and unicorn. I
Yeah,
love that.
so all of this is not to say that the US handles as a whole, or California even
Mm-hmm,
handles, like, yes, language access could be better, but if we're being
mm-hmm,
real, going around the
mm-hmm,
world, there are
mm-hmm.
not many places on earth that handle language equity, incredibly well.
Right.
I will say, as far as, being open to different pronunciations of a target language, the
Mm-hmm,
US does exceptionally well, right? So we don't really care what somebody's accent is, as long as we can understand for the most part, right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I'm
But I
kind of
think that,
reflecting.
just real quick, but I think for folks who are speaking with that accent,
Mhm.
there is a self consciousness that comes with it,
Oh, definitely.
and that's where it's, while folks who are predominantly speak English speakers might say, no, it's fine, I understand you, there is a hesitancy and a worry that
Yes.
they will be judged differently
Mhm.
because they're not speaking in the same way, right?
Yes.
And sorry to cut you off, but
No, 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 no. That's absolutely a valid point, and I think very much worth bringing into the conversation. Where I was going with this is, when I was learning to speak Vietnamese, that was a little
oh,
bit brutal, because it's a very different
oh,
sound
right,
system, of
yeah.
course, and
Mm-hmm,
then there are not many people outside of Vietnam who speak it, and so people are
mm-hmm,
not used to hearing
mm-hmm,
people try to speak it, right?
mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so it was not a very forgiving experience, right? One,
Mm-hmm.
it's a tonal language, so you've gotta get the
Yes.
tone just right,
Right.
and, as I said, it's very different sounds than English, so
Mm-hmm.
even trying to get there, it required a lot of persistence, right? And,
Right.
it was something that I would share with my students when I was a language teacher, to kinda
Mm-hmm.
help them to get over some of that hesitancy that you were bringing up, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's a huge, huge hurdle
Yeah.
for sure.
It is. It is. And if we think about how, while we want to believe that the United States and most Americans are very accepting of, accents and things like that, are we? And because it's like, oh, I didn't, once the person walks away, how many folks have the conversation of, I actually didn't really understand what they said, what was they talking about, it's, and it's, it's that thing of, how are you truly receiving
Yeah.
this, and how are you actually judging folks who are coming from a different place, who speak English differently, or who are just trying,
Mhm.
because it isn't their primary language. And then, when we encounter folks who are just like, oh, you should just speak English. I'm like, oh.
Right.
English is one of the most difficult languages to learn, right?
Yeah.
'Cause there are over 1 million words in it. It has so many different influences. Um, and how can you become proficient, and I sometimes I don't feel proficient. But fun fact, right? The word boondock,
Yeah.
right, actually comes from bundok
Mhm.
in Tagalog, which means mountains, right?
Yeah.
So just
Yeah,
like,
no, there are a
I like that
surprising
fact.
amount of, Filipino words that have entered into the English lexicon, but,
Mhm.
it's not credited, of course. But
Oh, that's
English is a mishmash of so many
right.
different languages,
Mhm.
and that often goes unacknowledged. But how do
Yeah.
people think that it became this way?
Right.
And the
Right.
fact is, people aren't really thinking about it, which is kind of
Right.
what we're talking about today. And being
Yeah.
more thoughtful about it, then we
Mhm.
can leverage other languages, the experiences of
Mhm.
other people,
Yeah.
to a much, much greater degree. And that's
Mhm.
certainly true in the workplace. So I
Yeah.
wonder how, from your perspective, the issue of language equity and access impact the work experience.
So I remember, a couple of years ago there was a big controversy, where there were Filipino nurses who were speaking Tagalog, um, and somebody got upset, right? And there's this whole thing about, oh, they should speak English in the workplace.
Mm,
And I was sitting there going, does this happen to people who are speaking Spanish? Does this happen to people who are speaking Mandarin or Cantonese? Does
mm,
this happen to people who are trying to engage their patients in their primary language if they recognize that they speak the same primary language, right? And so these that made me angry because, 1 in 5 nurses in the state of California is actually Filipino,
mhm.
right? And that is actually a blessing because the majority of Filipinos in the United States actually live in California. 43%
Wow.
of the entire Filipino population in the United States is in California. So why would you not want to have somebody who actually speaks this language, right? But
Yeah.
there are huge pockets of Filipinos in other places like Chicago, Illinois, Texas, New York, etc. And so again, trying to engage folks who are older, who are more comfortable, or even who are younger, who are more comfortable speaking Filipino, why should that be an issue?
Yeah.
And so when I think about English only policies, I feel like they're detrimental to the morale of a workforce, and it tells you that the skill that you have is not valuable. And I'm like, this is the most valuable thing that you can bring into the workforce. Because then that means that you can engage the people that, who are your customers, who are your patients, who are your students
Yeah.
in a more meaningful way. Um, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think often what I've seen is people say things like, "Oh, we need greater dialogue, we need greater understanding," but what they really mean is, "I want to have to explain myself less."
Yeah.
And that's a very different thing, right? It's work to
Yeah.
understand one
Yeah.
another, and a lot of people, let's be real, don't wanna put in the work. Now, that's not
Yes.
like a real accusation, that's we can link this back to biology, right?
Mhm.
It consumes energy
Mhm.
to be
Mhm.
alive, so our
Mhm.
brains are wired to create shortcuts for us so that we don't do that,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
But just because that's a biological reality doesn't mean that we can't change it, right? Of all the creatures on earth, we are the ones that alter reality all the time.
All the time.
So why
Mhm.
why can't we do it here? I don't
Right.
know if you have insight as to what the resistance might be.
I think part of it is resources, right? And I think about how difficult it is to get things translated sometimes. And when you receive the translations, and if even if so again, I've been learning this since I was 13. I can look at something in Tagalog and go, oh no, no, no. Especially for a Filipino American audience, right? Um, it's interesting because it becomes that question of, well, do we have the resources to pay somebody to do this? Do we have the people who are qualified? Yeah, that's a whole nother thing. To translate and interpret, right? And how do you make sure that they're conveying the thing that you want them to convey, but you don't understand? It's like, well, go take a class. Not to be, I'm not trying to be rude. It's that thing of, when people hear a language they don't understand, it's actually from a place of fear
Yes.
where they react. And
Mhm.
so in the workplace, it's like, oh, you're talking about me. Like,
Yeah.
no, I'm not talking about you. I just want some coffee. It's like,
Yeah.
and I'm just like, why is it that people assume that other people are talking about them?
So
You know?
this, I would link back to what I learned in getting my degree in conflict resolution. So one of the most stunning things that I keep coming back to time and time again is that, well, we know that when people compete over scarce resources, then
Yes.
that's a motivator of conflict.
Right.
Now, even the suggestion, like this. another group doesn't even actually have to exist. Just the suggestion of another group competing for scarce resources is enough to motivate conflict, right? So think about
Mhm.
that. You can tell a group of people who are just fine and not primed for conflict at all that there is another work group, another team, another town, another whatever out there, and they want the same thing that you have.
Mhm.
People will react instantly. Well, they can't have it, like
Mhm.
over my dead body, these kinds of things. Like, okay, but they
That's
don't
true.
actually exist. And yet that thing is still real,
Right.
you
Right.
know? And so if you're on a train, if you're from someplace where you're surrounded by people who are just like you and you hear an American accent from somewhere else, well, what's the reaction?
Mhm.
I think if people are reflecting, it's not always positive. So amplify that across like not only a different accent, but a different language, a
Mhm.
different skin color, a different way of thinking, a different, well, who knows?
Right.
And
Right.
so all of that conspires to create this well, stereotypes, right? So
Mhm.
or prejudice, ideas
Mhm.
of what people should be like.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
Fundamentally, that's simply unfair. In a globalized economy, if we are working with international people, like
Mhm.
we're convened to work together, not against
Mhm.
one another.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm. But this speaks to the question of equity,
hmm,
right? As we're kind of getting at, it is that question of how things are being distributed. But I think people forget that equal and equity are not the same thing.
right.
And there are going to be moments where it's like, look, more resources need to be given in this region for this group and for these reasons. And it's always this kind of, well, that's not fair because I didn't get the same. Do you need that? Right?
Yeah.
Do you actually need those sorts of supports? If the answer is no, then why are we having this conversation about you not getting the same thing? Like you already have that privilege or that power. So if we're going to talk about equity, language equity, right? We have to think about how we understand need, right?
Hmm.
Because equity is addressing need, right, and addressing gaps.
Right.
Um, so
Yeah.
yeah.
So, like, if we were to draw a parallel here of a family with
Mhm.
children of various ages or life
Mhm.
stages, right?
Mhm.
You would not deny the baby milk simply because the teenager also likes to drink milk. Like that, it just doesn't make sense, right? Buy more milk.
Yeah. Or if there's not enough milk, explain to the teenager you can drink water.
Yeah.
Like, it's like the baby needs milk. Stop.
So if we're thinking about language equity and the impact on the workplace experience, like how do you think that workplaces might change if greater language equity and access were realized? Maybe not only in
Mhm.
California,
Mhm.
but more broadly speaking.
I think one of the first things that can be done is, you know, recognize the value of folks speaking other languages. And if it's in a place where that language is predominantly spoken, then if we're going to go the capitalist route, well, maybe that person should actually be paid more because they can engage a specific community,
Hmm.
and I think that that's something that, again, with Filipinos, it's like, oh yeah, my English isn't good enough because I speak Filipino and my Filipino interferes with. I'm like, no, it's a valuable skill to be
Yeah.
able to speak and communicate and understand in this different language.
Hmm.
And I feel like for many lesser spoken languages, that skill is not valued. And
Yeah.
so I think in the workplace, if people say, you know what, that's really interesting and that's really cool that you can do that. You know what? We actually engage that community quite a bit. Do you think that we could figure out a way to, I don't know, have basic language courses or basic workshops, so that at the very least, right, there is a very visible presence um, of the company's valuation of language and
Yeah.
language diversity. Um, and that also boosts morale,
Hmm.
and it helps people feel like they're valued in the workplace. And so if you're valued in the workplace, you want to do better and be better. And I think that those are two things that within the workplace it would be really helpful. Because I know that there are so many folks who are just like, oh, I don't want to speak up because I don't think my English is good enough. Um,
Yeah, I
and
mean, it's hard to negotiate for a raise if you're
Mhm.
not confident in the language that you're speaking,
Right,
right? It's
right.
hard to report issues of harassment, of
Mhm,
prejudice, of
mhm,
racism if
mhm,
you are not comfortable relating to the people who are supposed to support you when these things happen.
right.
It's also hard to, really connect to the people that you're working with and to function in
Mhm,
that really fluid way if you've
mhm,
always got this sense in the back of your mind that they're not gonna understand what I'm saying.
right. And this is why affinity groups are so important. And some people, well, that's segregating people. It's like, no, it's people finding comfort and connection to folks because they see similarities. Because and affinity groups could be like, I go rock climbing.
Right,
That
yeah,
could be an affinity group.
yeah,
and
what it's
and
not is like, "Okay, all of you rock climbers, you have to hang out together," like, that's not what
Right,
it is.
exactly, exactly. And it's like, I've been working with a number of groups, in the state and in the nation, who are really kind of trying to develop that these spaces because they recognize that it's so important, right? And it is a way to demonstrate that they have a voice within that workplace too. I think that's really important as well. So.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Um, I mean, one of the kind of perennial hot button topics is immigration, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
for so many reasons, like what's the issue of the week? Like, well, maybe not the week, but now what we are seeing is there's certainly migration motivated by COVID, by climate change, by
Mhm.
so many factors.
Mhm.
So if we're kind of extending the lines out here,
Mhm.
like language equity and access, how do you see that kind of working to change our attitudes and behaviors toward immigration?
I think that, and I actually teach history of immigration, and I was having this
Perfect.
conversation with my students this week. It's this. I think that if there is more language access and movement toward equity, there cultivates a greater empathy for the immigrant experience. That it's and seeing it beyond an economic kind of lens, right?
Hmm.
These are people who have lives, who have families, who have cultures and traditions that they're bringing over,
Yeah.
and if they feel like those things are not valued, then what happens? You
Yeah.
know, one of the things that I think about is, while we laud the fact that we have so many people coming into the United States and are immigrating here, et cetera, the other side of that is recognizing that there's a brain drain in developing countries,
That's true. Yeah.
right? And what does that? How is that kind of propelled by the American dream in many ways? And when I talk about the American dream, I'm not just talking about the United States anymore. It's just that idea, particularly for the Philippines, of just getting out,
Right.
right? Um, and kind of thinking about it in that way. I think that there's so many different things that we can learn um, from each other, right? That people don't take into account or don't see as valuable, because it's like, well, you're here, you should be like this.
Right.
And that acculturation process is such a long one. You don't get
Yes.
here and just divest yourself completely, right? It's like, no, that doesn't, that's not
Yeah.
how it works, you know? And I think that in terms of equity and access, again, there's a greater willingness to recognize and honor the value of specific competencies and connections that immigrants bring to the workplace.
Yeah.
And I think that again, kind of elevating language access and equity would support that. Um,
Yeah, and given that a lot of organizational development, organizational change ideas are generated from U.S. institutions, often supported by the research of the very people who are part of that brain drain dynamic that you're talking about. Well, we could kind of see that if we were, as a nation, able to more broadly adopt policies that support language access and equity, well, perhaps other areas of the world could follow as well. And that could kind of mitigate some of these the what do you want to call it? Like the pooling of people from other nations just all flowing into the US. This could
Mhm.
also mean that people from the US could flow outward, and I think that would generally be a positive thing, right? Exposing more Americans to the different ways that people live, putting the shoe on the other foot. It's a humbling experience, let me tell you, everybody, but I think it's very, very worthwhile.
Well, and that's so interesting because it's a socioeconomic issue. It's a cultural issue, but I think that there's um, when Americans travel out, and I'm speaking stereotypically here now. People are just like, oh yeah, that person's American because they're loud, they're complaining a lot, and they're insisting that everybody just speak English,
Right.
and I find that fascinating because I also wonder, well, what was that person's experience prior to kind of going other places? What sorts of exposures have they had to different people who are actually here?
Hmm.
And how does that inform their ability to interact in a global community?
Yeah.
um
It's
yeah, it's
stunted.
say it again, sorry.
I think it's like a little bit of stunted growth, arrested development, if you will.
Mhm. Mhm. And I think that comes from this espousal of, the United States is the best country ever and the best place to be, and I get it, you know what I mean. I think every nation wants to kind of think of themselves in that way, but
Yeah.
um you know the United States brings that to a different level. American exceptionalism is a thing.
So you're
And
saying that we're number one at being number one? Because that's what I'm hearing.
yeah, and we say it over and over again, right? But
Yeah.
it's like, well, who gets to be number one, right? And who is able to kind of, again, access those things that are quintessentially American, even the very idea of seeing yourself only as American.
Right.
Who gets to do that?
Yeah.
And I think about I'm second generation, and I don't say that I'm American. I say I'm Filipino American. And a lot of that comes from the fact that if I just say that, oh, I'm American in an American context, the inevitable question will be like, no, 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 where are you from?
Where are you really from? From my mother. That's where.
It's just so funny because I'm just like, oh, don't ask me that because I'm just gonna get upset. And I don't think people understand what they're asking when they say, no, where are you really from?
Yeah.
You're basically saying that you don't belong here. I
Hmm.
don't recognize you as being part of this space.
Right.
You have an accent, so I don't recognize you as being part of this space. So even for immigrants, right? First generation immigrants, you know, they belong here too. If they've naturalized
Yeah.
politically, they belong here too. And so when you
Exactly.
ask them, it's like, no, where are you really from? It kind of digs into that thing of, it's like, oh, well, I guess I don't belong here. And you could argue, it's like, well, I was just asking because they do have an accent. It's like, yeah, but are you asking also about their experiences here in the United States? Are you immediately assuming that their experiences are outside of that context,
Right.
right?
So if we're talking more specifically about, racial equity, diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, and certainly belonging, well, how does better understanding language equity and access help us to kind of connect those dots and to really kind of see the value of diversity?
I it's I think if we had more language courses and access to language learning, to different languages, because there are definitely staples that are taught in the United States. Um, I think that it would, support again that idea of empathy and helping us understand that the United States is broader than the idea that that let's be real, lots of people, particularly immigrants, when they think about Americans and America, they think about folks who identify as white.
Yeah.
And
Captain
so
America.
and so if we think about, if more folks had access to language and language learning, that is just a gateway to saying, okay, I actually am more interested now in Vietnamese culture and Vietnamese American communities now.
Yeah.
Huh. I wonder what it's like in Westminster, which is the largest Filipino Vietnamese population outside of Vietnam, right?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
and thinking about it in that way. I wonder what's like Daly City is 33% Filipino and all the Filipino restaurants are here, It's like what it gives you that catalyst to be curious. And
Yeah.
I think that that's one of the things that I'd love to see more of. And not just, it's everybody. It's like I just wish more people would be curious,
Yeah.
in a deeper way. It's like
Mm.
we're more than lumpia and adobo, yo.
Definitely. Lumpia is amazing, but there's more to it than just that. I'll share with you, when I was teaching ESL, one of my favorite things to do with my students, and you mentioned proficiency, right,
Mhm,
is, I would help them with accent reduction, right? Because that's,
mhm,
an
mhm,
area of apprehension and one of the things that I specialized in. So to kinda get over some of that apprehension, what I would do is have them pair them up, have
mhm,
them teach one another a tongue twister in their native language, right? And that just brought the whole people were laughing, they kind of got a sense of what the other person's challenges were,
mhm,
for pronunciation. And by the end of it, they were, all without me prompting, "Oh, what does this mean? Oh,
mhm,
it's supposed to be a joke. Explain the joke to me." And then,
mhm,
to your point, that curiosity, and it would just blossom into this whole room full of
mhm,
conversations.
mhm,
And I would always feel bad about having to curtail it and bend it back towards my lesson.
mm,
But if you can do that in one classroom with like a really simple thing, what is possible if we get a lot of people getting on board to do that same kind of thing? Like that's the thing that's on my mind because and you're in education at a level
yeah.
that I've never really been in, but there's so much in our educational system that
Mhm.
works or conspires to stamp out curiosity, and it is the greatest tragedy of education.
Yeah, it is. It is. Before I wanted to actually go back to the notion of accent reduction
Yeah.
because I find that fascinating. And when I first learned about that, I was like, should I be offended by this? Why? Because it goes back to that question of, are we honoring,
Yeah,
right? Are we
normativity.
honoring the spaces that people are coming from? And is it necessarily a bad thing to say things in a particular way? It's not wrong, it's just
Yeah.
different, right? And so because I know that accent reduction is a huge thing, particularly in the Philippines, and
Mhm.
Filipinos take these courses so that they could work for call centers, and it can sound like they're coming, they're from anywhere in the United States. I'm like, no, I can tell you're Filipino.
Yeah,
I hear you.
immediately.
I
You
see
said my
you.
last name correctly. I know you're
Exactly.
Filipino.
Right? I'm just like, I hear you. And I just feel like that's if there was a way to say, you know what? Yes, I can identify where you're coming from. And that's okay, because you know what? I still understand your English. And I wish that there was a way to kind of move in that direction
Yeah.
rather than folks trying to say, okay, we need to reduce your accent because you have to sound like you're coming from this other place.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I'm like, oh, but I also know that speaks to, you know, perhaps assuages the apprehensions, like you were
Yeah.
saying, of folks who are learning English in a different country, and maybe that's my privilege being here. I can say it's like, you know what, it's okay if you speak it in a different in a different accent. I still understand you, but maybe that's not something that folks are ready to hear because they're struggling with that process of learning English.
Yeah, I feel like one of the things that my students I help them to realize is that yes, it's true that different accents have different values according to many people in the U.S. However, or anywhere really, but are you doing this for you or are you doing this for them? And I would actually, my students would hate it when I would do this, but I would say, okay, tell me who you want to sound like. And
Mm,
they say, what? I just want to sound like a normal person. Oh, I don't know what a normal person is, so tell me
yeah.
who you want to sound like.
Right, right. And I mean that evolves over time too, right? So living in the Midwest for 4 years, I picked up a slight Chicago accent where I can't say Chicago without
Chicago.
really trying. I say Chicago.
Yeah.
And, you know, and that's totally fine. You know, I that's just a minor thing, but you know, I think people would we would all be in a better place if we are able to hear and then honor
Hmm.
those differences.
Yeah.
And that's, I would argue that is also a facet of equity, in that we can say how you say things and speak is valid.
Hmm.
If you need something in a different language so that you understand it better, that is valid.
Yeah.
And we will do what we need to do to provide those resources in the language that helps you understand things best, you know.
Yes.
um
And, I think it often gets glossed over, but in fact, if we look at how American English in particular has evolved, it's clear that Americans, they love getting new words for things that they don't have words for.
mhm,
Love
mhm,
it. Just adopt them all the time.
right.
So why not just lean into that? Why not just accept that and take it further, right? We take everything else to the nth degree. Why not this?
Well, but English is the language of power,
Yes.
you know, and so if it goes too much to the wayside, where it has too much, right, of things that are not rooted in you know, the English that came over, and you know, colonial times, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then how will it still be a, you know, a vehicle for power? You know,
I
because
mean,
you
yeah.
can. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, no, that's a great question, and I'm regretting that we're running out of time because I think that one of the things that the U.S. does exceptionally well is
Mhm,
actually soft power, and in my perspective, it is the very fact that
mhm,
our language and our attitudes, our ideas evolve so quickly
mhm,
that it's something that's exciting for others around the world to see, and it's part of what keeps us kind of culturally relevant.
mhm.
Now, how that is leveraged, I mean, that's a whole other conversation,
Right.
yeah, the use of power is something I think about a lot, and
Yeah.
soft power, definitely as well. But
Yeah. And you can argue that again through American colonialism, that that use of English and the imposition of English as the language that united the archipelago through education, that was the penultimate kind of, you know, moment where America's soft power was manifested in
Oh
many
yeah.
ways, right?
Oh
In
yeah.
addition to, like, the war,
Oh,
but
that old
just,
thing.
yeah, that thing, right? But it was that use of English that
Yeah.
that you know cultivated this different culture around how we understand the importance of language. So
Yes. And on that note, so Lillian, what 30 seconds or less? No, not really 30 seconds or less, but what would you love to see come out of your work? And I don't know if you saw this earlier, but Bren popped in to say hi, said he loves what you do, Professor Villaraza. So thank you, Bren, for tuning in.
30 seconds
Not
come out
really
of
30 seconds. Take your time.
yeah. So my hope as an educator is that my students walk away with a greater sense of who they are and that curiosity, that they'll continue that work on their own, or you know they they continue to work with me, and we continue on that journey together, and that's really what I only hope for. And I'm seeing folks, even now, like a bunch of my students yesterday, like, we're going to put together a book club. I'm like, cool.
Oh,
And so,
they
and
should
I
talk
think
to Bren.
they were so enamored last week. It was Bren came to my class and they're just like, oh my god, Bren was the best. It was
So this
fantastic.
just to explain, if it wasn't clear already, Bren is a friend of mine and now a friend of Lillian's as well. And he created BFAB, that is the Boston Filipino American Book Club, which was
Yes.
kind of my connection to Filipino identity, Filipino
Yes.
American identity, when I was living in Boston. So I really kind of credit him with helping me along on my racial equity journey. And yeah, just really great to see that Bren's tuning in today. So thank you for all those things, Bren. You're an amazing person.
Yes.
Any
Absolutely.
final thoughts, Lillian?
Just thank you for having this conversation, having me in this conversation with you. It's been wonderful, and I hope that we can continue this conversation in different ways. So
Yes, definitely. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for watching. And if this got you curious about language access and equity, then maybe we did our job today. All right. This is Enrico E. Manalo for Intentionally Act Live. And we'll see you next time. Thanks so much. Bye.